the last 10 days before leaving this world. I decided to live according to Christopher's expectations, to be a gentle and virtuous mistress. I will no longer make a fuss about him favoring his concubine, and I will no longer cry every day, trying to move him with memories. Day 1, he saw me becoming gentle and submissive. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. This should have been the way long ago. The noblewomen in the city, which one is as domineering and jealous as you? By day 3, he frowned. His eyes were full of suspicion. Are you sure you understand your mistake? Now Isabella is pregnant. If you dare to harm her or the child in her womb, I will definitely not let you go. I calmly nodded. By day 5, he was clearly flustered. His voice was filled with anxiety and doubt. Sophia, why aren't you angry anymore? I smiled gently. Say it, Christopher, you are like this now. It's really a bit unlikable. Madam, your wedding dress was just taken by Isabella and ruined. The maid is kneeling on the ground, scared to look up, even breathing carefully. If I had encountered something like this before, I would have definitely been furious. I would have rushed over to confront Christopher directly. But this time, I just calmly replied, Really? The servants on the ground looked at me so calmly. They exchanged glances, as if they couldn't believe I suddenly became so gentle. I stood up, randomly pointed to a maid. Go bring me the clothes I used to wear. When I rushed over with the clothes, I saw Isabella had already cut the wedding dress into tatters. Christopher was carefully protecting her nearby, afraid she would get hurt by the scissors. At the same time, he was softly comforting her. If you're angry, it doesn't matter if I cut more clothes. But Sophia is just an unreasonable person. Why bother arguing with her? I stopped in my tracks. A faint cold smile appeared at the corner of my mouth. A husband who once vowed never to take a concubine. Now, for another woman, he actually says I'm insane. Christopher looked up, as if he sensed something. When he saw me, his eyes revealed a hint of impatience. What are you doing here? Yesterday you swapped Isabella's medicine for contraceptives. I haven't settled the score with you yet. You actually dare to come right to me. I didn't rush to explain myself like before. I just stared at that wedding dress that was cut to pieces. That wedding dress was what I wore when I first married Christopher. At that time, he was just a minor scholar, spent all my savings, could only buy this piece of red cloth, just barely made it into my wedding dress. Although it is cheap and rough, but I cherish it very much. I remember clearly. He looked very apologetic. He said he would prepare a grand wedding for me after high school. He did indeed keep his promise. However, at that time, when stepping into the marriage hall with him besides me, there was also Isabella, who grew up with me. The two women married him at the same time. This absurd situation made me the laughingstock of all New York, because his marriage to Isabella was something he personally asked the president for in high school. Others dared not casually comment on Isabella, but they could openly laugh at me. Christopher looked at me in silence, becoming increasingly impatient. He said, If you still want to disrupt this family, then keep making a scene. If you still want this family to be restless, then just continue to make a fuss. But don't make Isabella and me feel annoyed here. I lower my head. Let the maid behind you take those clothes over, then calmly say, I know I was wrong. So I specially brought all the clothes to appease Isabella. Christopher was stunned. He looked up at me in surprise. Those clothes were all given to me by him before. One of them is something I often wore when I was with him. Just a glance. The intimate moments with him will instantly flash in my mind. Despite that, I still handed the items to him. Let him decide how to handle it himself. But Christopher didn't seem as relaxed as I expected. He stared at me intently. His eyes revealed a hint of anger. After a while, he suddenly let out a cold laugh. Sophia, what are you up to again? Do you think you can fool me like this and make me get along with you? He seemed quite certain. I'm doing this just to win him back. Isabella doesn't believe it either. She leans against Christopher. She looks at me with a provocative gaze. Since the lady sincerely admits her mistake, then I will accept this goodwill. She gave a signal. The maid nearby immediately came over. She tore the clothes I brought into pieces. The harsh sound of tearing echoed continuously, just like the bits and pieces of my years with Christopher. As each piece of clothing was torn apart, they gradually disappeared without a trace. Christopher didn't stop me. He leisurely watched me, as if waiting for me to get angry like before, or to be particularly sad. But I just lowered my head, smiled a little, and said, since that's the case, then I'll take my leave first. A sudden sound of something breaking came from behind. It seemed like Christopher was angry and smashed the cup beside him, but I didn't turn back. The next day, Isabella came to trouble me as usual when the maid called me over. She has turned my private storage room upside down. The tiger head hat and the patchwork clothes I painstakingly embroidered all night, and the rattle drum and little wooden horse made by Christopher himself, have all been carelessly thrown on the ground. Christopher is not here. Isabella doesn't even want to pretend anymore. She stepped on the tiger head hat, looking at me with contempt. I remember you lost a child before. I remained silent, silently watching her. Isabella laughed again. I heard she was raising money for Christopher's exam travel expenses. As a result, she exhausted herself. That's true. Christopher's family is in decline. His health is also very weak. Every day, apart from burying himself in his studies, he can't take care of anything else. The burden of the family is all on my shoulders. I leave home to set up my stall before dawn. I return home only after dark, exhausted beyond measure. As a result, the child in my womb was also lost. At that time, he held me as I cried uncontrollably. He comforted me with a trembling voice. Sophia, we will have children in the future. I, Christopher, in this lifetime, will never let you down. But he ultimately broke his promise. Later, Christopher entered high school. He completely forgot the promise he once made to me. He didn't even greet me. He hurriedly requested the president to approve his marriage to Isabella. On the day I married Isabella, he chose to spend the wedding night with her. At that time, I was still unwilling to give up. Upon hearing this news, I couldn't believe it. I immediately ran to find him, however. I only heard the sounds of him and Isabella being intimate. I stood outside the door all night. The feelings in my heart gradually grew cold, but I still felt a bit unwilling that I stayed here for him. Yet he treated me this way. Isabella saw a hint of pain on my face. She coldly mocked me. Sophia, you really deserve to live like this in your life. What does it matter if you suffer alongside him and weather the storms? When he succeeds, the first person he remembers is still me. She walked in front of me, placed her hand on her belly and gently stroked it. She whispered in my ear, "Your child is gone, but I am pregnant now. This is fate, isn't it? When I give birth to the child, he will be the legitimate son of the household. You are now the mistress. What does it matter if you temporarily suppress me? You have no children now, and you cannot win Christopher's affection. In the future, in this household, what status will you have?" I fell silent for a moment, bent down to pick up the tiger hat and the patchwork robe from the ground, gently patted them off, smiled calmly. I just feel fortunate now. The child was not born. Isabella didn't expect me to say that. I was momentarily stunned. At that moment, a sudden gasp came from outside the door. Christopher kicked my maid down. He stood at the door with a gloomy expression. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. He stared at me intently. He gritted his teeth and questioned me. "Sophia, what are you saying?" I pretended not to hear. I walked over to help the trembling maid up. I silently walked outside. Christopher tightly grabbed my wrist. His voice sounded like it was squeezed out between his teeth. "Sophia, speak. That was our only child. How could you say such a cold-hearted thing?" I gently raised the corners of my mouth. I smiled faintly. Those were just irrelevant, idle words. The most critical thing right now is still the child Isabella is carrying. Christopher was momentarily stunned. The strength in my hands relaxed accordingly. I seized the opportunity. I quickly broke free from his grip. I walked away briskly. Christopher didn't stop me again. He happily walked up to Isabella, excited yet cautiously. He held her in his arms. He said, "Isabella, you are pregnant." Just now, he was still feeling sad about the child we had lost. He even blamed me for being too heartless. But in the blink of an eye, he threw all that aside, embracing another woman, joyfully waiting for another child's arrival. If he cared, how could he not see the toys on the ground that belonged to the deceased child? After all, those toys were all carved by his own hands, piece by piece. I couldn't help but sneer inside. I felt an immense disgust for Christopher's hypocrisy. On the third day, Christopher took a leave of absence from Congress, specifically to accompany Isabella. By evening, he took the initiative to come find me. He warned sternly, "Sophia, this time Isabella is pregnant. If you dare to hurt her and the child in her womb, I will never let you go." I nodded calmly. I said okay. Christopher looked at my submissive demeanor. He frowned slightly. He didn't say anything further. Instead, he started taking off his clothes. He walked towards me. "Isabella is pregnant. It's inconvenient for her physically. I will live here from now on." I instinctively took a step back. I avoided his touch. Christopher's hand reached for me but stopped midair. His face showed an unhappy expression. "Sophia, what do you mean by that?" I lowered my head. I said softly, "Isabella has just become pregnant. Now is the time she needs companionship. If you stay with me tonight, Isabella might overthink. Worried it will affect the child in her womb." I'm speaking each word seriously, but Christopher's expression still looks unpleasant. Perhaps he's reminded of the past, the time when we were so close. Back then, I always held him tightly, snuggled in his arms. It felt like he was my everything. No matter what, we shouldn't be as distant and cold as we are now. Christopher's face is gloomy. I quietly meet his gaze, without saying a word. After a while, he suddenly reaches out and abruptly tears off half of my clothes. I was startled, but he suddenly pulls me into his arms and pushes me onto the bed. His deep voice carries a hint of tenderness, whispers in my ear, "Sophia, I don't believe this is your true intention. I have said before, we can still have more children. Now Isabella is pregnant. You should give me another child. What do you think?" I suddenly feel a wave of discomfort in my heart. I pushed hard against his chest. I turned my head to one side. I didn't want him to kiss me. Christopher was taken aback for a moment, but he had no intention of stopping. On the contrary, he pressed me down on the bed more eagerly. I struggled desperately. In the end, I really had no choice. I raised my hand and slapped him. He seemed stunned by my slap. He was dazed for a moment. After a while, he looked at me. In the end, Christopher still left. The maid outside told him that Isabella was looking for him. He immediately turned and left, without looking back. I could no longer hold it in. I leaned over the edge of the bed and retched painfully. At that moment, the system's voice suddenly echoed in my mind, with a hint of confusion and sadness. "You weren't like this before. You did so much for him. You had clearly succeeded before. Why did he still choose to forgive Isabella? Who abandoned him back then? How could it be different with you? It has become like this now." I endure the discomfort in my heart. I just sneered when I heard that. "Yeah, I can't understand it either. How did we end up like this? When I came into this world, he had just failed his exam. The family fell into ruin. He had nothing. Even the originally promised Isabella called off the engagement. Later, he offended powerful people. His legs were broken. He couldn't even afford to treat his injuries. If it weren't for my appearance, I slowly pulled him out of his predicament. I'm afraid that in this world, Christopher would have long been gone. Later, I successfully won him over. We indeed had a sweet and harmonious time together. He would put the only warm piece of clothing in the house on me during the cold winter, even when he himself was weak. Even if he himself is physically weak, shivering from the cold, he will be there when I want to eat a pear. Quietly walked over dozens of miles of mountain roads, to the market to buy medicine with my own money, buy me a sweet pear. I was touched by him, used points to exchange for his exceptional talent and healthy body. Precisely because of this, he could achieve the position of Secretary of State today. Not long after, he forgot the hardships we once shared, married Isabella. That night, I stood outside their new house. I heard him scolding Isabella loudly inside, saying she was after wealth and status, leaving him after he failed the exam. Isabella cried and said it was her parents who pressured her. She still loved him in her heart. He believed her so easily. Later, Isabella turned around and accused him, saying he married me right after breaking off the engagement. He tightly hugged Isabella, explaining that he only felt gratitude towards me. He also said that marrying me was only because my name has the word moon in it, just like Isabella in his eyes. Let Isabella and me marry him together. It would be unfair to her. But because I am his original wife, he cannot easily abandon me. The day before I even for him, refused the opportunity to go back with the system, willingly chose to stay by his side. But who would have thought? Everything turned to nothing in an instant. Once deep feelings now seem so ridiculous. Fortunately now, I have new choices. I told the system, I don't want to wait another 7 days. I want to leave immediately. The system paused for a moment, then said, building a path for you to leave this world will take some time, but I can take you away from here first. It's just, are you willing? I smiled and answered without hesitation. Of course I am willing. On the 4th day, I didn't go anywhere, just stay quietly in the room, waiting for the system to take me away. Christopher suddenly changed. He used to not come to my yard for 10 days or half a month, but now he often comes to sit with me. Yet my attitude towards him has grown increasingly cold. Christopher is clearly panicking. By the 5th day, he was injured by a sword. He stumbled and ran in front of me. He called me softly, Sophia, I'm hurt. Look at me. I won't rush to apply medicine for him anymore, nor will I stay by his side all night to help him recover. Christopher is panicking, like when we were the most in love. He grabbed the corner of my clothes. Trembling, he asked me, "Sophia, do you not care about me anymore? I actually hope you would be like before, arguing and making a fuss with me. Instead of being so cold like now." I looked up at him. I smiled gently. "Your husband is joking. In the past, I was the one who didn't understand. A husband can marry a wife and take concubines. Indeed, it is a good thing." Christopher's eyes were red. He looked at me for a while. He said softly, "You never used to say the word concubine." After saying that, he hurriedly turned and left. I silently called out to the system in my heart. He said softly, "We should go now." "Okay, host. I am currently recovering Christopher's talents, health, and literary skills. I have disappeared." Christopher quickly noticed this matter. The room's decor was the same as usual. Beside the coffee table were my unfinished book and half-drunk tea. It looked like I had just gone out for a stroll on a whim, rather than having planned to leave long ago. However, Christopher seemed to sense something. He sat blankly in my room for several hours, even when Isabella sent someone to call him. He didn't react at all. I had not shown myself in front of him all this time. In these few hours, Christopher's expression changed from calm to agitated. He paced back and forth in the room like a madman, as if he were looking for me, but he found nothing. He stood in the middle of the room. The anger on his face gradually faded away. He replaced it with a confused expression. At first glance, he looked like a child who lost a treasure, not knowing what to do. After a while, he closed his eyes. In a hoarse voice, he shouted outside, to let the servant outside come in. The servant looked a bit confused. He looked at Christopher with puzzlement. He asked, "To find the lady. Who are you looking for?" Veins bulged on Christopher's forehead. He shouted in a lowered voice, "The lady of this household." Who else could it be? Christopher was usually gentle and polite in front of the servants. He rarely lost his composure like this. The servant was frightened and flustered. He rolled and crawled his way out. In a little while, a figure walked in lightly. Christopher heard the noise. He suddenly raised his head to look at the doorway. As that person walked into the candlelight, they revealed a beautiful and enchanting face. However, Christopher's expression suddenly turned dim. His disappointment was unmistakable. Isabella had never seen such an expression on Christopher. She was taken aback for a moment. Then she stepped forward and softly said, "Christopher, what are you doing? I had someone call you earlier. You didn't come. Now you've called me here." She paused for a moment, concealing the displeasure in her eyes. Then she continued, "You called me here. Is Sophia causing trouble again?" She seemed to care, but there was a hint of schadenfreude in her eyes. She probably thinks Christopher and I had another fight. But this time, Christopher was just staring at her intensely. His gaze was icy cold. "I said I was going to find the lady. How could they call for you?" Isabella was taken aback for a moment. "Christopher, what do you mean by that?" Christopher did not answer her. His gaze swept over the kneeling servants and maids. He gasped for breath and asked, "You ask, which lady of the house? Who are you referring to?" The servants looked at each other. After a while, they cautiously replied, "It must be her, Isabella." Christopher suddenly clenched his fingers. It seemed he thought of something. He began to look around the shabby furnishings of my room. Although it was winter, there was no fire lit in the room. The only thing that could keep warm was the thin blanket on the bed. Even the tea leaves in the cup were the cheapest kind from the house. This tea even had a musty smell. It's something even the servants wouldn't go near. Yet it appeared in my teacup. Christopher took a glance. His eyes gradually turned red. His hands trembled slightly. He asked in a deep voice, "How do you usually treat her like this? She is my wife, the only lady in this household. But her life is worse than that of a servant. How dare you treat her like this?" He suddenly stood up violently. He knocked everything off the tea table onto the floor. His face was filled with rage. Tea cup shards flew everywhere. They cut several people's faces, but no one dared to speak. Isabella was also stunned. Only I silently watched everything from the side, secretly mocking in my heart. Christopher is so angry, yet he forgot the true instigator of it all. It was actually himself. He insisted on marrying and taking a concubine on the same day. He made me lose face in front of everyone. He particularly dotes on Isabella in the manor. He has given her the greatest power. It's precisely because of this. Under Isabella's hints, the servants' attitude towards me has become worse. Although these subordinates like to flatter those in power, if it weren't for his intentional or unintentional indulgence, they wouldn't dare to be so disrespectful to me. Christopher may have thought of the reason, or maybe he hasn't thought about it. He was extremely angry. He drove all those servants away. Then he covered his face with his hands. His shoulders were shaking, but he didn't make a sound. I don't understand why he is doing this now, and I don't want to care. The system made me invisible. He can't see me. Actually, I'm standing right next to him. The system and I watched this wonderful performance together. After a long while, he finally asked me, "There are still 2 days left. Do you want to stay here? Let's go somewhere else for a while." I took a deep breath. I was just about to respond. Christopher suddenly looked up. He glanced towards me and the system. I was momentarily stunned. I instinctively moved to the side, but soon I realized this might just be a coincidence. Christopher's gaze swept aimlessly over here. His eyes were vacant. He truly couldn't see me. Isabella still hadn't figured out the situation. She bit her lip. She gently placed her hand on Christopher's chest. She said softly, "Christopher, what's wrong with you? Did Sophia say something to you again you misunderstood?" Christopher held her hand. His expression was cold. After a moment, he finally spoke. "Sophia is missing." Isabella was taken aback. She almost couldn't hide her joy on her face. "Really?" Christopher said in a cold tone. "You seem pretty happy." Isabella quickly said, "How is that possible, no matter how she treats me? But she did help you a lot at the crucial moment. I only regret being influenced by my parents back then. I wasn't able to be by your side. As a result, she took up so much of your time." Isabella had tears in her eyes. She looked at Christopher with a pitiful expression. In the past, whenever she cried, Christopher would rush to cheer her up, but this time he acted as if he didn't see her. Instead, he looked straight at me again. I looked at the system with some suspicion, but the system seemed very confident. "Don't worry, he definitely won't find us." I finally breathed a sigh of relief. I casually answered the system's question. "Let's go back to Texas and take a look. I wonder if the plum blossom forest is in bloom there." The system remained silent, but Christopher suddenly spoke up. "It's my fault for making you suffer. Since that's the case, I'll make you my concubine." A hint of joy flashed in Isabella's eyes, but she hesitated while speaking. If Sophia knew about this, she definitely wouldn't agree. Christopher was still looking my way. After a while, he could only smile wryly and press his lips together. No, she had long stopped caring. If she still cared, she should have. I didn't hear the rest clearly. However, I no longer cared. I just didn't expect that I had disappeared for such a short time. Christopher was eager to arrange a ranking for Isabella. The system saw that I had no reaction and asked me again, "Are you sure you want to go to Texas?" I shifted my gaze away from Christopher. I gently responded with a soft Before long, the system transported me from the mansion to Texas. I stood in front of the house where I used to live with Christopher. Unfortunately, the plum blossoms in the village had not yet bloomed. After leaving Washington, the system no longer helps me hide my identity. Auntie Grace next door recognized me at a glance. She exclaimed happily, "Sophia, is that you? You've come back. Why isn't Christopher with you?" I gently held her aged hand. A wave of sorrow surged in my heart. Even now, I am still an orphan. If it weren't for Christopher, I wouldn't have chosen to stay. But for him, I have also suffered a lot. The love I've received has been very little. Even after experiencing 2 lifetimes, only Auntie Grace in front of me once treated me wholeheartedly. This is why I decided to return to Texas in the last 2 days. I'm telling the truth. I have divorced Christopher. I will be leaving here soon, so before I go, I wanted to come back and see you. Auntie Grace listened. She was taken aback for a moment, but she didn't ask much. Her eyes revealed a look of pain. Her warm hand gently rested on my hair. "Go ahead. You must have gone through a lot of difficulties. That's why you made this choice." I felt a lump in my throat. I almost shed tears. In Washington, even if Christopher marries Isabella, people still think I've benefited immensely. After all, Christopher has been in politics since high school. He rose all the way to Secretary of State. The future is bright. I'm just an ordinary countrywoman. Christopher can always be by my side, letting me be his wife. Life is carefree. That's already very good for me. Over the years, I endured countless mockeries and disdain. I thought I had long gotten used to it, but unexpectedly, today, it made my long-suppressed emotions burst out all at once. I threw myself into Auntie Grace's embrace, silently shedding tears of grievance. In the evening, I lay in the warm bed Auntie Grace prepared for me. I felt a long-lost sense of peace. Outside the window, I don't know when it started pouring rain. Amidst the booming thunder, suddenly I heard someone knocking at the door. The knocks became more urgent. Clearly, the other person was anxious. I was taken aback for a moment. I quickly got up to open the door. I was surprised to see Christopher outside the door. He should have been miles away. I looked at him in astonishment. He looked very tired. His whole body was soaked from the rain, as if he had rushed over. He stared straight at me. Then he forcefully pulled me into his embrace. "Sophia, I finally found you." His voice was choked with emotion. Something warm dripped onto my neck, but his body felt as cold as ice. It made me feel both cold and uncomfortable. I pushed him away with force. I brushed off the droplets on my body. "Christopher, please have some self-respect." Christopher's eyes widened. He hurriedly grabbed my hand. "Sophia, don't do this. I'm your husband. You're so cold to me. I'm really sad." I smiled faintly. "Go on." "No. Christopher's wife, her name is Isabella. She's waiting for you at home in Washington. She's also carrying your child." Christopher shook his head helplessly. "No, in my heart. You will always be my only wife, Sophia. I was wrong before. As long as you are willing to go back with me, I will end my relationship with Isabella immediately. Is that okay?" I'm a bit surprised. He said during the day that he wanted to make Isabella a concubine. How come he's changed so much in front of me? I didn't take it too seriously. I just glanced at him lightly. I said calmly, "No need, I've already stopped caring." Christopher just finished speaking. His face was already pale. Now it looks even more frighteningly white. His lips trembled. It seemed he wanted to say something more, but under my indifferent gaze, he ultimately swallowed his words. He stood at the door, refusing to leave. I couldn't close the door, and I didn't want to stand with him in the cold wind. So I had to coldly scold him. "Enough. Christopher, this is my home. If you don't leave, I can only call the police to handle it. It's so late. Don't disturb people here." It's annoying. Those words were said without any politeness. Christopher's expression darkened. He looked at me and opened his mouth in the end. He turned and walked into the rain. I had no intention of softening my heart. I simply closed the door firmly. The rain outside fell heavier and heavier, but I slept soundly, completely undisturbed, until the next morning. I was awakened by Auntie Grace's calls. It turned out that Christopher had been standing outside the whole time. He had been soaked in the rain all night. In the morning, Auntie Grace got up. She found him fainted at the door. "Sophia, what happened between you and Christopher?" Auntie Grace stopped herself mid-sentence. Because she has a kind heart, she still helped Christopher into the house. She took care of him attentively. I looked at Christopher, who was frowning even in his unconscious state. I said indifferently, "It doesn't matter. I have nothing to do with him anymore. If Auntie Grace cares about him, taking care of him for a day is no problem." Auntie Grace sighed and said, "You used to treat him so well, but now it has come to this. It must be that he doesn't understand gratitude. He did something to wrong you. Now that he is sick, I cannot just ignore him. Let him stay for a day. Sophia, don't overthink it. I don't mind. Anyway, I'm leaving today. I still don't want to be in the same room as Christopher." I walked out the door. A bright scene appeared before me. After last night's heavy rain, the plum blossom grove next to the village surprisingly bloomed overnight. The view before me is refreshing. I smiled faintly. I turned to ask the system, which had transformed into a white light, "When are we leaving today? If it's later, I can enjoy this beautiful scenery a bit longer. That would be worth it." The system replied seriously, "At midnight tonight. Once the passage is built, we can leave." I nodded. There's still time. At that moment, a sad call came from behind me. "Sophia." I turned my head to find Christopher had already woken up. He was standing behind me. His eyes were even sadder than yesterday. He asked me, "Sophia, can you come back with me?" His face has an unhealthy reddish hue, like a terminally ill patient experiencing a brief improvement before death. I remember the system mentioned, if I plan to leave, everything that was used on him will be recalled and returned to me. It seems now, his illness was not caused by getting caught in the rain. The health I gave him is gradually fading away. I'm afraid his illness cannot be cured. Christopher hasn't noticed yet. He looks at me in silence, then takes a few more steps forward. "Sophia, don't ignore me. I'm sick. You used to make me medicine and keep me company. But now, his eyes are dim. He forces a smile. "I understand it's all my fault. Sophia, can you talk with me for a bit? I'm very scared." As soon as he opened his mouth, I interrupted him. I asked coldly, "What are you afraid of?" Christopher opened his mouth. His voice was a bit hoarse. "I'm afraid you won't want me." I let out a cold laugh. I looked at him calmly. "Christopher, you understand. I'm actually scared too. When I first arrived here, I had no relatives or friends around. I could only rely on you as my sole support. I treated you wholeheartedly. I just hoped you would care about me a little more. Later, we developed feelings for each other. I thought we would live happily like this forever, but you still betrayed me. You married someone else. You threw me away like a worn-out shoe, as if I were just a stone on the roadside, a little ant at your feet. At that time, I was much more deeply afraid than you are now, because in this world, besides you, I have no other support. Christopher's body stiffened. He looked at me for a long time. He said in a low voice, "You approached me at the beginning. Wasn't it just to complete the task?" I was stunned. I looked at him. For a moment, I didn't know how he discovered it. The system was also in chaos. He shouted in my ear. He said he would check if there was a problem. Then it disappeared. However, Christopher's expression relaxed as the system left. He took out a wooden hairpin from his pocket. That was the night before I decided to leave the system behind. He gave it to me. Sophia, I already knew all of this when I first learned about it. I felt very upset. At that time, I was at the lowest point in my life. My studies were not going well. I was being ostracized. My legs were paralyzed. My fiancé also left me. As a result, even the only person who treated me well turned out to have other intentions. Later, I heard you say, "You were willing to stay for me in this place. I'm very happy, but I still want to teach you a lesson." So later, I married Isabella, but the person I truly love in my heart has always been you. He handed me a wooden hairpin. His gaze was filled with deep affection. "Sophia, I know I was wrong." He hadn't finished speaking. I couldn't help but burst out laughing. Then, I casually broke that cheap wooden hairpin and threw it on the ground. I had always kept this wooden hairpin well. Looking back now, it was probably just something he used to keep me from leaving. A random thing to fool me. "Christopher, you really make me uncomfortable." I held back a cold smile at the corners of my mouth, looking at Christopher in disgust. "You married Isabella. It's just that you couldn't accept being dumped by her when he achieves success, even if she has already married someone else. He is also forcefully trying to marry her back, so he can feel proud of himself. And here we are today. It's just because you think I have nowhere to go in this world." "Nowhere to go. I can only stay by your side. That's why you dare to bully me without any scruples." I paused for a moment. My tone became colder. "Christopher, we've been together for so long. Do you really think I can't see through you? Maybe you really regret it now, but what good does that do? I no longer love you." These words directly exposed Christopher's hypocritical mask. He seemed unable to accept this fact. He took a few steps back. With red eyes, he looked at the other person, shaking his head with a pale face. "Sophia, things are not as you think. It's really not." He was anxiously stomping his feet, but the words were stuck in his throat. "But I just can't say it." I let out a deep breath. I looked at him calmly. "Christopher, that's enough. That day I said I was very grateful our child wasn't born. It wasn't said lightly. That was my heartfelt truth, because I didn't want any more. And this unbreakable bond between us." This sentence became the last straw that broke Christopher. He collapsed on the ground. Weeping quietly, I brushed past him, without looking back. At midnight, after saying goodbye to Auntie Grace, the system appeared on time. "Host, are you ready?" I nodded. Christopher suddenly rushed out. He tightly embraced me with his warm arms. "Sophia, don't go, I beg you." The system prompt sound rang out, preparing to leave the world. "The countdown starts now, 1 minute." I lowered my head. I took one last look at Christopher, whose eyes were red. "Let's just leave it at that. Isabella is still waiting for you at home." Christopher looked up at me. He held me tightly. His voice carried a helpless plea. "Sophia, I will separate from her. Please don't leave me." That day I said I would let her be my equal wife. It was because I heard your voices to deliberately provoke you. I wanted to get you to come out. "Sophia, you can argue and fuss with me like before. I will never get angry again, I'm begging you." He spoke with great sadness, but I felt nothing inside. The system confirmed with me one last time. 10 seconds left. "Are you sure you want to leave?" I nodded immediately. 19, 18. Christopher looked at me anxiously, still unable to accept this reality. He tried to grab me, but his legs suddenly gave out. He fell to the ground. After I left, the legs he had healed with my points became disabled again. He felt it too. His eyes were filled with despair and pain. "Sophia, don't go." 3, 2, 1. In the next second, I disappeared from his sight. Faintly, I seemed to hear a very sad cry. After returning home, I exchanged my returned points for new rewards from the system. Later, I lived the life I wanted in this familiar world. No need to work, no worries, having both money and time. After a while, the system came to find me again, to tell me why Christopher knew about the system's existence. After I successfully conquered him, his love for me reached 100%. At this point, he could hear our conversation. When he learned the truth, I was taken aback for a moment, but I wasn't too surprised. Christopher's love is too cheap. I've long since stopped valuing it. Later, the system showed me Christopher's ultimate fate. After I left, he lost his talent and health. His legs became disabled again. This kind of Christopher could no longer serve as Secretary of State, and soon became the subject of everyone's ridicule. The news of my departure spread. Everyone was laughing at him, saying he favored his mistress and abandoned his original wife. That's why he ended up in such a miserable situation. Not long after, he was demoted to a remote place and became an inconspicuous minor official. Isabella saw this situation and felt scared inside. She wanted to sneak away, but was discovered by Christopher. He not only injured her face, but also locked her up at home like a dog. Christopher has completely changed. He yelled loudly at the moaning Isabella. "It used to be you who wrote to me about how your husband treated you poorly, asking me to help you leave. You also said, if it weren't for your parents forcing you, you could definitely do better than the old Sophia. Then why don't you take action now? You caused me to lose Sophia. Isabella, you got what you deserved." A harsh sound continued to come from the system's mirror. I watched this couple blame each other. I yawned in boredom. What does this have to do with me? The thing that gives me the biggest headache right now is what to eat for dinner tonight.